3 days after they put her husband in the ground, Margaret Thornton was alone. The November wind found every crack in the cabin walls, just like grief had found every crack in her heart. On the table was a letter from her husband's brother, James. The words were a brand on her memory. The cabin belongs to the Thornton family. You have no claim here. Find somewhere else to go. 26 years old, a widow for less than a month, and now cast out. Thomas had been a miner. The shaft collapsed. 8 men went down that morning. Only 5 came back up. The company offered condolences, nothing else. And the Thorntons, who never wanted their son marrying a woman with no name and no money, they offered even less. She packed her life into a single carpet bag. 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, a photo of her and Thomas, his smile so bright it hurt to look at. She closed the door on the life she'd built, the sound echoing in her bones. The Wyoming Territory stretched out before her, vast and unforgiving. Winter was coming, and she had nowhere to go. She walked away from the town of Bitter Creek, away from the whispers. The Widow Thornton, they'd called her, like it was her fault. Every door had closed in her face. The boarding house, the general store, even the saloon. We're not hiring. The road was just wagon ruts in the frozen earth. By afternoon, the wind was a razor. She knocked at a farmhouse, hoping for work. A woman's face, etched with pity and fear, turned her away. It wouldn't be proper, she'd said. Proper. As if that mattered when you were freezing to death. The next house was miles off. An old man on the porch looked her over in a way that made her skin crawl. Could use some company on these long winter nights, he'd offered, his laughter chasing her down the road. Then the snow began. At first it was almost beautiful. Then it became a blinding white wall. The wind howled, and soon she couldn't see 10 feet in front of her. Stopping meant death, so she kept walking. Her fingers went numb. Ice formed on her eyelashes. Night fell, a seamless blend of gray sky and white earth. She was stumbling now, her body shaking so hard her teeth ached. She thought of Thomas, his warm smile, his strong hands. But the memories were frozen, distant. A shape loomed in the storm. A barn. Hope flared, hot and painful in her chest. But it was abandoned. The roof caved in. Useless. Despair hit her harder than the wind. She sank to her knees in the snow, too cold to cry, too tired to feel anything but a deep, spreading numbness. Her body stopped shivering. She knew what that meant. The end of the fight. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she whispered. She let herself fall forward into the soft white darkness. The last thing she remembered was the strange sensation of being lifted, of warmth after so much cold, and a voice deep and urgent, cutting through the storm. "Hold on. Just hold on." The world returned in pieces. First warmth, then the crackle of a fire, the scent of coffee. Margaret's eyes fluttered open. She was lying on a soft bed, covered in heavy blankets that smelled of leather and pine. She was in a cabin, but not hers. This one was solid, built of thick logs that held the howling wind at bay. A man stood by the stove. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered by the elements. When he turned and saw her awake, he approached slowly, like he was dealing with a spooked animal. "You're awake?" he said. His voice was deep, quiet. "Wasn't sure you would be." Panic seized her. She was alone in a stranger's cabin, completely at his mercy. Her hands flew to her clothes. She was still dressed, her wet outer things removed and drying by the fire. "Where?" she whispered, her throat raw. "My ranch. Found you about 2 miles south. Half buried." He poured a cup of water and offered it to her. "Daniel Morrison, this is the Circle M Ranch." She took the cup, watching him over the rim. He kept a respectful distance. "My things. Your bag's by the door. Nothing's been touched." He went back to the stove. "You've been out for a full day. Storm's still blowing. Nobody's going anywhere for a while. A full day." Her stomach growled, a sharp, empty ache. As if he'd heard, Morrison ladled broth into a bowl. "Just this for now. Need to warm up from the inside." He set it on a small table beside her bed and retreated, giving her space. The broth tasted like life itself. "Why?" she asked between spoonfuls. "Why did you help me?" Morrison was cleaning his rifle. his movements methodical. Saw your tracks from the ridge. Figured whoever made 'em was in trouble. Would have done the same for anyone. But not everyone would have, she thought. So many had turned her away. I should go, she said, though the thought of facing that storm again was terrifying. I don't want to impose. Go where? He asked. The simple question had no answer. When she said nothing, he continued. Storm won't break for days. You're welcome to stay. The offer was a lifeline. But what would people say? Her reputation was already in tatters. She had to work for her keep. She could cook, clean, mend. No need, he said, meeting her eyes. You're not a servant, you're a guest. The simple kindness of it almost broke her. She blinked back tears. He seemed to sense her fragile state and busied himself with the fire. There's a curtain for privacy. I'll bed down by the fire. His tone left no room for argument. Rest, everything else can wait. She drew the curtain, a thin piece of fabric that felt like a fortress. In the firelight, she finally allowed herself to take stock. She was alive. She was warm. She was safe. For now. She woke once in the night. The fire was low. She saw Morrison through a gap in the curtain, staring into the flames. His profile was etched in gold, and the sadness on his face was so profound, it made her own heart ache. What ghosts haunted Daniel Morrison? What loss had carved those lines around his eyes? The storm raged, but the walls of the cabin held. Margaret fell back asleep, not to dreams of Thomas this time, but to the quiet breathing of the man who had pulled her from the snow. A man who seemed to carry a storm of his own inside him. The storm broke on the third day, leaving a world buried in white. Margaret stood at the window, watching the sun glitter on the endless snow. I should be going, she said. It was a lie. She had nowhere to go. Daniel Morrison looked up from the harness he was mending. Where to? The question hung in the air, sharp and unavoidable. I'll find somewhere. In Bitter Creek, they turned you away once, he stated, not unkindly. Carson City's 40 miles west. You planning to walk? Heat rose in her cheeks. I'll manage. The way you managed in that storm? His gaze was direct, seeing right through her pride. I'm not your responsibility. No, he agreed. But sending you back out there to freeze or starve, that would weigh on me. She knew what the town would say. A widow living with an unmarried man. It was ruin. People will talk. People always talk, he said, his focus on his work. Doesn't mean we have to listen. He paused. There's an old foreman's cabin 100 yards from here. Needs cleaning, but it's sound. You could stay there if you're concerned about propriety. A separate cabin. Independence. Dignity. The relief was so sharp it was painful. I have to pay my way. I can cook. Clean. Can you read and write? He interrupted. Yes. Then you can help with the account books. Numbers give me a headache. A slight smile touched his lips, the first she'd seen. Fair trade for room and board, until spring. She found herself nodding. Until spring. That evening they shared a meal in the main house. It was a careful, quiet affair. How long have you been alone here? She finally asked. His jaw tightened. 3 years come spring. 3 years. Long enough for grief to become a part of you. I'm sorry, she said softly. He looked at her then, and a silent understanding passed between them. Two people marked by loss, recognizing the scars on each other's souls. My wife Sarah, he said, his voice rough. Cholera took her, and our son. He was 2. Margaret's hand moved across the table, stopping just short of his. I'm so sorry, Daniel. That's why I understood, he said, his gaze distant. When I found you in that snow, the way you'd just given up, I knew that feeling. He looked at her. The work saves us, Margaret, even when we don't want to be saved. She knew he was right. She had just started to learn that herself. He walked her back to her cabin in the moonlight, a respectful distance between them. You're safe here, he said at her door. It wasn't a platitude. It was a promise. That night, for the first time since Thomas had died, Margaret allowed herself to think beyond mere survival. She had shelter. She had work. She had a purpose. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but as she banked the fire in her small, safe cabin, she felt a flicker of something she thought was gone forever. It felt like peace, but she couldn't shake a new chilling thought. Daniel Morrison had a ranch, land, cattle, a lonely man, a vulnerable man, and she was a desperate woman. What if the people in town weren't entirely wrong? What if, in saving her, he had just invited a different kind of danger into his home? The next day, Margaret insisted on helping with the ranch work. Daniel hesitated, but she saw the flicker of respect in his eyes when he handed her a pair of oversized work gloves. Her body ached from the cold and the unfamiliar labor, but it was a good ache, an honest ache. She learned to break the ice on the water troughs, to fork hay from the loft, to read the signs of a sick steer in the herd. Each evening she transformed his simple bachelor's fare into a real meal, and each evening they would talk. Little by little, the walls around Daniel's grief began to crumble. He told her about Sarah's laugh, about his son's first steps. In return, she told him about Thomas, about his kindness, his dreams of buying a farm. They were building a fragile bridge between their two solitudes, woven from shared memories and mutual respect. But the town hadn't forgotten them. 4 riders came on a Tuesday, their faces mean with whiskey and boredom. Frank Coulter, the store owner who'd turned her away, was at their head. "Morrison," he called out, "heard you got yourself some company." Daniel met them in the yard, his stance relaxed but ready. "What do you want, Coulter?" "Just concerned citizens," Coulter sneered. "Worried about a lonely man and a desperate widow. Funny how a grieving woman recovers so quick when there's a warm bed involved." Margaret stepped out of the barn, her hands clenched. She couldn't let Daniel fight this alone. "I believe you are discussing me," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. Coulter's eyes raked over her. "Pretty speech, Mrs. Thornton, but talk is cheap. A woman's reputation is a fragile thing. Be a shame if folks got the wrong idea." It was a threat, plain and simple. "Leave, or we'll destroy what little you have left." "I offered this woman work and shelter because it was the right thing to do," Daniel said, his voice dropping low. "That hasn't changed because some fools from town want to make it ugly." He took a step toward Coulter. "Now get off my land." The men rode off with a string of curses, but Margaret knew this wasn't over. The confrontation had changed something. The whispers of the town had become a tangible threat. That night she couldn't sleep. The quiet of the valley felt menacing. Then she heard it, a faint scraping sound outside her cabin window. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She crept to the window and peered out. A figure was moving in the shadows near the woodpile. It wasn't one of Coulter's men. This person was smaller, moving with a desperate haste. They placed something on her windowsill, a small, dark object, then melted back into the night. Her hands shaking, Margaret opened the door a crack. On the sill was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, and tucked beneath it, a folded piece of paper. It was a note. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. "They're lying. It wasn't a cave-in. James Thornton sabotaged the supports. He killed his own brother for the mine. He's coming for you next. Get out." The world tilted. Thomas hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered, and his brother, the man who had sent her that cruel letter, was behind it. He wasn't just casting her out. He was erasing a witness. The note wasn't signed. But the little bird, she'd seen one just like it before. In the hands of a young boy at the mine, the son of one of the men who had died alongside Thomas. A boy who had been there that morning. A witness. The pieces slammed together with brutal force. James wanted the mine, and now he wanted her silenced. Coulter and his men weren't just gossips. They were a tool, sent to drive her out, to isolate her, to make her vulnerable. She had to warn Daniel. She grabbed the note and ran for the main house, her feet slipping in the snow. But she was too late. A new group of riders was approaching, not drunk townsmen this time. These men were armed for war, and at their head on a fine black horse was a man she recognized from her wedding photograph. James Thornton had come to finish the job. The blizzard came out of nowhere. 1 minute she was helping Daniel with a fence line. The next, the world was a wall of white. "To the house!" Daniel roared, grabbing her arm. They stumbled through the blinding snow, his grip the only thing keeping her upright. They crashed through the door just as the full force of the storm hit, the cabin shaking under the assault. They were trapped, together. For 2 days the storm raged, shrinking their world to the four walls of the cabin. They fell into a rhythm, tending the fire, sharing meals, their careful distance shrinking with every shared hour. On the second night, with the wind screaming like a banshee, Daniel pulled out an old fiddle. He played mountain songs, sad and beautiful, filling the small space with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He told her about his wife, Sarah, about their son, Daniel Jr. He spoke of a love so bright it still cast a shadow over his life. In return, she told him about Thomas, about his gentle nature and his off-key whistling. They were two people sharing ghosts, finding comfort in the echo of each other's grief. "I'm glad you're here," Daniel said, his voice rough in the firelight. The ranch, it felt less empty these past weeks. Something fluttered in Margaret's chest, a feeling she thought had been buried with Thomas. It was terrifying. It was hopeful. The storm broke on the third morning, revealing a world silent and white, but the peace was shattered by the thunder of hooves. Margaret's blood ran cold. It was Jake Daniels and Coulter's crew, their faces twisted with liquor and malice. "Morrison!" Daniel screamed. "We've come to settle accounts!" Daniel grabbed his rifle. "Stay inside, Margaret." But she couldn't. She watched from the barn as they dragged him from his porch, overwhelming him with sheer numbers. That's when she saw it. One of the men creeping toward the barn with a torch. They were going to burn everything. She didn't think. She grabbed the shotgun Daniel kept by the door, stepped out into the snow, and fired a blast into the air. The men froze, turning to see her standing there, a lone woman in a nightdress and coat, the shotgun steady in her hands. "Next one goes into somebody," she said, her voice a stranger to her own ears. "Now step away from him." A man laughed. "Look at this, boys. The widow's got teeth. I grew up shooting rabbits for supper," she said, lowering the barrel to his chest. "A man's a much bigger target." Just as the standoff was about to explode into bloodshed, more riders appeared. It was the territorial marshal, Sam Hayes, and two deputies. "Got a report of trouble out this way," the marshal said, his eyes taking in the scene. Someone had ridden for help. But who? Faced with the law, the mob dissolved, riding off with a volley of threats. As they disappeared, Margaret's strength gave out, her arms shaking. Daniel was at her side in an instant, taking the heavy gun from her hands. "You saved my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved mine first," she whispered back. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. The air between them crackled with an unspoken truth. In the cold Wyoming night, under the silent gaze of the mountains, they were no longer just a rancher and a widow. They were partners, survivors. But a chilling question remained. Who was the silent ally who had summoned the marshal? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning of their troubles, not the end? Spring thawed the valley, but a new kind of cold had settled in Margaret's heart. The unsigned note and the carved bird were a constant, terrifying reminder. James Thornton killed his own brother. She finally showed the note to Daniel. He stared at it, his face turning to granite. "If this is true," he said, his voice a low growl, "then every friendly face in town could be a liar." Their fragile peace was gone, replaced by a gnawing suspicion. Who could they trust? The answer, it turned out, was no one. The sabotage started small. A cut fence line, letting a dozen cattle wander off. A spoiled sack of seed corn. Then their well was poisoned. They found the water brackish and foul one morning, a dead bird floating on the surface. If they hadn't noticed, they'd both be dead. It was a war of whispers and shadows. James was trying to break them, to drive them off the land before he had to get his own hands dirty. They took the note to Marshal Hayes. He was a good man, but he was practical. "An unsigned note and a child's toy?" he said, his brow furrowed. "It's not enough to move on a man like James Thornton. He's got money, influence. I need proof, Margaret. Hard proof." The proof was buried with the only other witness, the boy who had carved the bird. His mother, another miner's widow, had taken him and fled the territory weeks ago, terrified into silence by threats from the mining company, a company James now controlled. They were alone, and they were being hunted. The isolation forged a new intimacy between them. They worked side by side from dawn till dusk, their shared danger a constant, unspoken bond. The foreman's cabin became a forgotten outpost. Margaret moved her things into the main house for safety. Propriety was a luxury they could no longer afford. One night, sitting by the fire, Daniel looked at her, his gray eyes full of a pain she recognized. "I'm not Thomas," he said quietly. "I can't give you what he would have." "I'm not asking you to be," she whispered back. "I'm just asking you to stay alive." That's when he kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of desperation. Two lonely, frightened people finding a moment of solace in a world that had turned against them. The next day, a letter arrived, bearing the seal of a prestigious law firm. It was an offer from the railroad, a generous offer to buy the Circle M ranch. The land, it turned out, was directly in the path of a planned expansion. It was the final piece of the puzzle. James didn't just want the mine. He wanted to sell the land to the railroad for a fortune. He had murdered his brother, terrorized his widow, and poisoned their well, all for a contract. "This is it," Daniel said, his face grim. "This is the proof Hayes needs. This is motive." But as they saddled the horses for the ride to town, they saw the riders on the ridge. Not a drunken mob this time. These were hired guns, rifles glinting in the sun. James had stopped playing games. He had come to finish it. The siege was brutal. James Thornton's men were professionals, pinning them inside the cabin with a relentless hail of bullets. The solid logs Daniel's father had laid held strong, but it was only a matter of time. "There's a root cellar," Daniel yelled over the gunfire. "A tunnel. It leads out to the creek bed. My father built it for Indian raids." He grabbed her arm. "You have to go, Margaret. Get to town. Get Hayes." "I'm not leaving you." "You have to. That letter from the railroad? It's the only proof we have. If we both die here, he wins." He shoved the letter into her hands, his eyes boring into hers. "I've already lost one family in this house. I won't lose another." He kissed her, hard and fast. "Now go!" She scrambled into the dark, earthy-smelling tunnel, the sound of the gun battle fading behind her. She emerged in the thick brush by the creek, her heart pounding. She had to run. She had to get help. But as she looked back at the cabin, she saw something that made her blood run cold. One of the gunmen wasn't shooting. He was moving toward the barn, with a torch. The memory of the last attack, of Daniel's fury at the threat to his animals, his home, flashed through her mind. He would never abandon the ranch. He would fight until the end. She couldn't do it. She couldn't run. She still had the shotgun. She circled around, using the creek for cover, her mind racing. The gunmen were focused on the front of the house. They wouldn't expect an attack from the rear, from a woman they had dismissed as a worthless widow. She came up behind the man with the torch just as he was about to set the barn ablaze. She didn't hesitate. The blast from the shotgun sent him sprawling. The other gunman spun around, confused. In that moment of distraction, Daniel burst from the house, his own rifle blazing. It was a desperate, impossible fight, 2 against 5. But they were fighting for their home, for their lives, for a future they had only just begun to imagine. A bullet grazed Margaret's arm, a searing line of fire. She stumbled but didn't fall. She saw a rifle swing toward Daniel. She screamed his name. Another shot rang out, but it wasn't hers. One of the gunmen crumpled to the ground. Then another. Marshal Hayes and his deputies had arrived, charging into the valley like the cavalry in a dime novel. The remaining gunmen threw down their weapons, their faces a mask of shock. It was over. In the sudden, ringing silence, Daniel ran to her, his face pale with fear. He saw the blood on her arm. "Margaret." "It's nothing," she whispered, leaning against him, her strength finally giving out. "You're safe." "We're safe," he corrected her, holding her tight. James Thornton was arrested, his conspiracy with the railroad exposed. The trial was the biggest scandal the territory had ever seen. The letter, combined with the testimony of the captured gunman, was enough. He was sentenced to hang. Months later, Margaret stood on the porch of the home she had helped defend. Her arm was scarred, but it was a reminder of what she had fought for. Daniel came to stand beside her, his arm settling around her waist in a familiar, comforting gesture. Marshal Hayes was here, he said. He told me who sent for him that night. The night Coulter's men came. Who was it? The woman from the farmhouse, he said. The one who turned you away. She said she couldn't sleep, knowing she'd sent a woman out into the cold. Her husband was in town, so she rode for the marshal herself, asked him not to say who'd sent for him. She was afraid of what her husband would do. Margaret thought of that woman's scared, kind eyes, a small act of courage that had changed everything. The town is changing, Daniel said. People are seeing things differently. He turned her to face him. Margaret, I asked you to be my wife once, in the spring. It was too soon, but the seasons have turned. We've faced down ghosts and gunmen. We've rebuilt a life from the ashes. He took a small box from his pocket. Inside was a simple gold band. I love you, Margaret Thornton. Not as a replacement for what I lost, but as the woman who brought this ranch and me back to life. Will you marry me? Tears streamed down her face, but this time they were tears of joy. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Daniel, I will. Their wedding wasn't in a cold, empty church. It was right there, in the valley with the mountains as their witness and the whole town in attendance. The widow who had been cast out was now the heart of their community, a symbol of resilience and strength. And as Daniel slipped the ring on her finger, she knew she was finally home. She had survived the storm, both outside and within, and found not just shelter, but a love as strong and enduring as the mountains themselves. If this story of second chances touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel. Every love story from the Wild West deserves to be told, and your support helps us bring them to you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, partners. Next time.